Hello, hello. Welcome to Reading Time. My name's Time, and this week we're reading Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. Let's get to reading. Peter Pan is a story about three children, Wendy, John, and Michael Darling, who go on a magical adventure to a fantasy land called Neverland with Peter Pan, a boy who never grows up. I'm sure that you have heard of Peter Pan or are somewhat familiar with it. If you are familiar with the Disney adaptation, that's a pretty accurate representation of the book. I would give this book a 3 out of 5 star rating. I didn't particularly hate the book or enjoy it, so it kind of sits in the middle for me. I do think that I would have enjoyed it more if it were not for some of the content in the book that I'll get into a little bit later. Before I get into the content, though, I would say that this book is about a 5th through 8th grade reading level. I think that that age range would be interested in the adventures in the story, but would also be able to understand some of the more complex feelings and emotions throughout the book, and would be able to handle some of the more mature content in the book. As far as content goes, there's nothing really explicitly mature about it, but there is a lot of content that I personally had issue with. One of the main issues I had was the amount of violence in the book. I wasn't expecting there to be so much violence, and while we don't see a lot of it on screen, so to speak, there are many instances of the children, Peter Pan and the Lost Boys namely, murdering pirates and other people. There are even instances where Peter Pan is described as having forgotten doing something and a body will be found where he was. And there's a line that says when the Lost Boys start to grow up that Peter Pan starts to whittle down their numbers, implying that he probably kills the Lost Boys if they get too old. Another piece of content to be aware of is substance usage. There's not a lot of substance usage in the beginning of the book or really throughout it, but near the end, the Lost Boys and Peter Pan start to imitate being pirates, and as part of their imitation, they do smoke tobacco and cigars. As far as sexual content goes in the book, there's not a lot of it. Peter Pan and Wendy do share thimbles, at least that's what Wendy calls them, but really they just share a couple of kisses. However, Peter doesn't seem to know the intent behind this gesture or what it means, and Wendy does have a crush on him, so there's a little bit of this weird innocence about Peter that makes the kisses feel a little weird to me personally. And finally, other content to be aware of in the book. If you have seen the Disney adaptation of Peter Pan, I'm sure that you have seen the racist depictions of Native Americans present in the story. And the book is not much better. If anything, it might be worse than the movie depiction, as the depictions made are very racist and do not reflect Native American culture or peoples accurately at all. I'm not going to get into my thoughts on racism and other social issues in books in this video, as I've already gone over this specific topic in my other video about Little House on the Prairie. If you're interested in viewing that and knowing what my thoughts are about the topic, go ahead and hop over to that video. I'll link it down in the description of this video. As I said earlier, this book is kind of middle of the road for me. There are elements of it that I like, and there are elements of it that I find distasteful personally. But even with this kind of middle of the road feeling, there are things that really did stand out to me with this book. And one of that is the surreal, whimsical writing throughout the book. I was expecting there to be this whimsical feeling when the characters got to Neverland, because that's a fantasy island with fairies and mermaids and pirates and all sorts of adventures and other things that don't necessarily make sense. However, right off the bat, this book is introducing uh, the Darling household in London as one that has these whimsical elements with it. For example, the book presents the children's nurse as a dog named Nana, and no one questions this. And Nana is presented as having opinions and thoughts and feelings about the situations that are going on around her. This would actually be an example of personification. And Barrie seems to really enjoy using personification throughout the book. If you're not familiar, personification is when you give human attributes to non-human things, like objects or animals. So, for example, if I were to say lightning danced across the sky, I would be personifying lightning, because lightning cannot dance. That's something that people do. But it does give the image of lightning flashing across the sky. It gives my reader or audience a better idea of how they can visualize what I'm talking about. So I do think that this book could be used to teach personification. Another thing that I found interesting with this book is that even though the children come back home in the end and are reunited with their family, and there's this sense that when the Darling children grow up and move on, that their lives are good, this book is ultimately a tragedy. The name of the book is Peter Pan. So this is a story about Peter Pan, even though the main focus does seem to be the Darling children. And the reason that this book is a tragedy is because Peter Pan, the namesake of the book, has a fear of growing up. So intense of a fear that he makes it so that he is unable to grow up. Peter is presented as a character that is full of himself and is violent and sees the world in a black and white sort of viewpoint where things either are or they aren't a certain way. And in this sense, he is very much like a young child. Now, the tragedy is, while being a young child isn't a bad thing, he cannot grow or progress because he refuses to grow up. He's afraid to grow up. And he has a tendency to forget things. There are moments in the book where he forgets the other characters and then remembers them. And because he forgets, these actions he takes that may be violent or maybe concerning are as if they had not happened because he does not remember them. So even though Peter Pan could be argued to be the villain of the book because he basically kidnaps the Darling children, murders a bunch of people, and almost tries to stop the Darling children from coming home at the end, it's hard to really see him that way because he is still a child, even though we don't know really how long he's been alive, as time is weird between Neverland and the real world, and we don't really have an indication at any point how long he's been a child. It's hard to be mad at him, and it's hard to see him as a villain, even after seeing all of these things that he's done. Really, at the end of the book, I just felt bad for him. And that is why I don't dislike the book. Even with all of the content issues I have with it, there was something profound about this book being a tragedy. Now, with all of that, I still found myself asking, why is this a children's book? This doesn't seem appropriate for children. But I guess there are other things that people read and consume that might not be age appropriate. This week's poster square I found to be more recognizable than most of the other ones because we see Peter from the Disney adaptation, just his little head outline. If you have read Peter Pan, let me know what you thought about the content and the story in general. Was this one that you enjoyed? Is it one that you would read again? What do you think about Peter Pan as a character himself? If you would like to follow along with this reading challenge, please feel free to subscribe to the channel and follow me on Facebook and Instagram for weekly updates on what books we're reading this week. And as always, have a marvelous week and a wonderful read.